Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a palace long after the candles have been lit, where the air smells faintly of wax, damp stone, and secrets that refuse to stay buried. You are moving through corridors polished by centuries of anxious footsteps, and even before you see a crown, you can feel the pressure it carries. Somewhere nearby, silk brushes against a wall, a door closes a little too softly and a life begins to tilt off balance. This is one of those stories where you probably won't survive this emotionally unscathed fair warning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't enter a palace the way you enter an ordinary building, you're absorbed into it. The walls don't just hold ceilings, they hold memories, grudges, and unfinished conversations that never found daylight. As you walk, you realize something unsettling. Royal lives are rarely destroyed by swords or poisons first. They're undone by whispers, by pauses in conversation, by looks exchanged when you leave the room a second too early. This is where Palace Intrigue begins, not with drama but with silence. You pass tapestries stitched with heroic battles and noble marriages, all propaganda in thread form. Beneath them, real wars are fought without armor. A courtier bows just a fraction deeper to one person than another. A servant repeats a sentence with one word subtly changed. A queen notices even if she pretends not to. You're learning the first rule of palace life. Everything is observed and nothing is forgotten. If this were modern times, someone would be live tweeting the tension, but instead it lives in raised eyebrows and carefully neutral smiles. One mainstream historical fact sets the tone here. Early modern European courts, especially in places like Versailles or Tudor England, were intensely centralized environments. Power clustered physically around the monarch. To be near the king or queen was to exist in a pressure cooker where access meant survival. Historians still argue whether this closeness made rulers more informed or more dangerously insulated, but everyone agrees on one thing: it made intrigue inevitable. You can feel it already. The closer people stand together, the less room there is for truth. You stop near a window overlooking a courtyard. Somewhere below, a carriage arrives late. That lateness will be noted. It will be interpreted. Maybe it was mud on the road. Maybe it was intentional disrespect. Maybe tomorrow someone will casually mention it to the wrong person. Palace intrigue thrives on plausible deniability. No one ever says, "I am destroying you." They say, "Isn't it odd that, there's a quirky tidbit that rarely makes it into textbooks." Some courts employed professional listeners, individuals whose unofficial job was simply to stand near doors, gardens, or staircases and remember conversations. They weren't spies in the cinematic sense. They were human echo chambers. You'd be amazed how many royal downfalls started with something muttered while half asleep or half drunk, assuming no one important was listening. And you, walking here now, realize how exhausting this must have been. Imagine never relaxing your face, never speaking without rehearsing, never trusting silence because silence could mean someone else is filling it for you. You'd probably develop a twitch too. Don't worry, it's historically accurate. You move on and the corridor narrows slightly. This part of the palace feels older, colder. The stones sweat in winter. This is where you sense the emotional architecture of intrigue. Palaces were designed not just to impress, but to control movement and visibility. Long corridors forced encounters. Small antechambers created bottlenecks where people waited together, pretending not to listen. Historians still argue whether these designs were intentional tools of surveillance or simply practical choices that became weaponized over time. Either way, they worked. You imagine a young noblewoman standing here centuries ago, rehearsing what she'll say when the door opens. She knows one sentence could earn her favor or suspicion. She's not plotting treason, she's just trying to survive. That's another thing Palace Intrigue teaches you early. Destruction doesn't require villains, it only requires incentives. Someone else passes you now, their footsteps measured. They nod politely, eyes flicking over you in a way that suggests cataloguing. In courts, people were evaluated constantly. Who you spoke to, how long, how often. There's a light joke courtiers used to tell: if you wanted privacy, you should shout, because whispers travelled faster. It's funny until you realize how true it was. You pause, sensing the weight of future disasters hovering here, like dust motes in candlelight. Many royal lives that ended in scandal or exile began in rooms like this, with no obvious threat. Take Anne Boleyn, for instance. Long before her trial and execution, she lived in a court saturated with rumour, where her rise itself made enemies. Mainstream history tells us about her downfall. What it sometimes skips is how early the narrative against her began, shaped by those who resented her proximity to power. Historians still argue whether her fate was sealed by genuine political danger or by accumulated courtly resentment that finally found an excuse. You don't need a conspiracy when you have momentum. And momentum builds quietly. One repeated joke, one nickname, one story retold with a smirk. Courts were small worlds with long memories, and once a version of you existed in that collective imagination, escaping it was nearly impossible. Think of it as the worst group chat in history, except leaving it could get you imprisoned. You lean against the wall and listen. Somewhere, laughter breaks out. Not warm laughter, performative laughter, the kind that checks first to see who else is laughing. This is another lesson Palace Intrigue teaches you. Joy is strategic. Even happiness must be aligned with power. Laugh at the wrong thing or not at all, and you mark yourself as suspicious. There's a fringe detail scholars love to debate in footnotes. Some courtiers deliberately cultivated reputations as fools or harmless eccentrics to avoid becoming targets. Acting dull could be a form of armor. It didn't always work, but it's oddly comforting to think that being underestimated was once a survival tactic. Historians still argue whether these court fools by choice were truly safe or simply ignored until convenient to sacrifice. As you continue, you realize something unsettlingly modern about all this. The palace operates like an algorithm. Attention equals power, visibility equals risk. Engagement determines survival. If this were social media, some of these royals would be cancelled before breakfast. Light joke number 2. At least back then, screenshots took longer. You reach a set of doors, slightly ajar. Inside, a council chamber waits, empty for now. Chairs arranged carefully, positions fixed. Where you sit matters. Who sits closest matters more. These rooms are where whispers harden into policy. A suggestion floated here can become a law that ruins a life elsewhere. And because responsibility is shared, blame is diluted. Everyone was just advising. This is where intrigues graduate from personal to lethal. You stand there a moment, absorbing how the palace itself seems complicit. It doesn't scream or threaten, it just facilitates. It provides spaces where secrets feel safe until they aren't. And you begin to understand why so many royal figures later described court life as suffocating, even when surrounded by luxury. Gold doesn't soften paranoia, it amplifies it. One final observation before you move on: intrigue destroys slowly at first. It erodes trust, sleep, confidence. By the time public scandal erupts, the person at its center is often already exhausted, isolated, and primed to fall. Historians still argue whether this gradual psychological collapse was an unintended consequence of court life or a feature quietly exploited by those who knew how to wait. You step back into the corridor, leaving the council chamber behind. The whispers continue without you. They don't need you. They never did. And as you walk on, deeper into the palace, you realize this was only the beginning. The corridors have more to say. You don't notice the shift at first. The palace feels the same polished floors, same deliberate quiet. But something has changed. You're now watching how favor moves through the court like a warm current, invisible but unmistakable. Someone has it today, someone else has lost it. And you learn very quickly that favor is never neutral. It is never a compliment. It is a weapon disguised as affection. You spot it in small things. A chair pulled closer to the fire. A name mentioned slightly more often in conversation. A monarch remembering a detail about your childhood and forgetting someone else's entirely. In modern terms, this would be called being seen, but here it's closer to being illuminated under a magnifying glass. Favor warms you and burns you at the same time. One mainstream historical fact anchors this reality. Early courts operated on patronage systems, offices, income, marriages, even legal protection depended on royal favor. Merit mattered far less than access. Historians still argue whether patronage was an efficient way to govern or a breeding ground for corruption, but no one disputes its psychological toll. When everything depends on one person's mood, everyone becomes hyper-attuned to that mood. You can feel it now, the way courtiers subtly orbit whoever is closest to power. Today that's you, or at least it feels like it. Compliments arrive wrapped in concern. Advice arrives disguised as loyalty. Be careful, someone murmurs, not unkindly. Others are watching you. That's not a warning. It's a reminder of gravity. Here's the first fatal mistake favor encourages, believing it's personal. You start to think you earned this attention, your wit, your charm, your loyalty. And maybe that's partly true, but favor is less about who you are and more about what you represent at a given moment. A faction, a threat, a convenience. The palace doesn't love individuals, it uses them. Light joker number 1, think of yourself as a limited edition collectible, highly valued until the next one drops. You notice glances now, not hostile yet, but assessing. People who once nodded politely now linger just long enough to be seen near you, then drift away. Association is currency and they're hedging their bets. Someone laughs a little too hard at your joke, then glances around to make sure it landed safely. You realize how exhausting it must be to calibrate every reaction like this, every hour of every day. There's a quirky tidbit that feels almost absurd until you think about it too long. In some courts, favorites were tracked by how often their names appeared in royal correspondence. Clerks noticed patterns. So did rivals. If your name showed up too frequently, you weren't just important. You were exposed. Paper trails were the medieval equivalent of receipts, and they ruined lives just as efficiently. Favor also breeds flattery, and flattery breeds bad decisions. You're praised for things you haven't done yet. You're encouraged to speak on matters you don't fully understand. Someone suggests a bold move, framing it as confidence rather than risk. Historians still argue whether favorites acted out of arrogance or pressure, but the line between the two was razor-thin. When everyone around you agrees, disagreement starts to feel like betrayal. You make a small choice. Maybe you accept a role. Maybe you repeat a private comment, thinking it harmless. Maybe you fail to push back against a lie because correcting it would feel awkward. This is the second fatal mistake, assuming small actions stay small. In the palace, nothing does. You pass through a gallery and catch sight of a portrait, someone who was once favored too. You recognize the posture, confident, almost defiant. Their eyes follow you, or at least it feels that way. History tells you they didn't end well. Exile, disgrace, execution, pick your flavor. What the plaque doesn't tell you is how ordinary their rise probably felt at first. Favor rarely announces itself as danger. Another light joke because you need it. Being the favorite is like being the teacher's pet in a class where classmates carry knives. As favor settles on you, rivalries crystallize elsewhere. People who once ignored each other now find common ground in disliking you. Shared resentment is a powerful adhesive. Conversations you're not invited to become more frequent. Doors close more softly. The palace hasn't turned against you yet, but it's adjusting. There's an ongoing scholarly debate here worth sitting with. Historians still argue whether royal favourites were scapegoats by design, absorbing blame, meant for the monarch, or whether they genuinely overstepped their bounds. The truth is uncomfortable. Both can be true at once. Favour lifts you high enough that the fall feels justified to those watching. You begin to sense the trap. To step back now would look like weakness. To step forward looks like ambition. Either way, someone will interpret it as guilt. The palace doesn't reward balance, it rewards momentum until it doesn't. As you move deeper into the day, the warmth of favour feels less comforting. It's spotlight heat now. You can't tell who's smiling with you and who's measuring you for the drop. And the worst part? You can't afford to ask. You leave the gallery behind, carrying the weight of attention like an invisible cloak. Somewhere nearby, alliances are forming that don't include you. Somewhere else, a compliment you accepted too easily is already being retold with a twist. Favour has done its work. The mistake has been made. And the palace, patient as ever, is ready for the next phase. You start to notice the smiles before you notice the fear. They're everywhere now, smooth, practiced, perfectly timed. The palace has shifted into a higher gear, and politeness has become its sharpest instrument. No one raises their voice. No one breaks protocol. And yet you feel watched more closely than ever. This is where queens, especially, begin to disappear in plain sight. You walk beside a woman in silk and jewels, her posture immaculate, her expression serene. She is doing everything right. That's the problem. In court life, perfection invites inspection. Queens are praised as symbols, not treated as people, and symbols are easy to control. You feel how the expectations settle on her shoulders like invisible weights, pressing down without leaving marks. One mainstream historical fact frames this cruelty. Queens consort were rarely granted formal power, yet were held responsible for dynastic success, producing heirs, embodying virtue, and maintaining political alliances. Historians still argue whether this contradiction was intentional or simply an unexamined tradition, but its effect was devastating. Queens were judged relentlessly for outcomes they could not fully control. You sensed the surveillance now. Ladies in waiting who were supposed to be companions double as observers. Confessors listen a little too closely. Even personal correspondence is never truly private. A queen's household is a court within a court, and it leaks constantly. The smile she wears isn't warmth, it's armor. There's a quirky, unsettling tidbit here. Some queens deliberately altered their handwriting or phrasing in letters to confuse potential readers. It was an early form of self-censorship, a way to maintain fragments of privacy. Historians still debate how effective this was, but the practice itself tells you everything about the atmosphere. When love letters feel dangerous, something is deeply wrong. You watch how politeness becomes a trap. A queen must never appear jealous, angry, or frightened. Any deviation is reframed as instability. If she complains, she's difficult. If she stays silent, she's cold. If she laughs too freely, she's improper. The palace demands emotional perfection while quietly waiting for her to fail. Light joke number 1, whispered carefully. Being a queen is like being on a reality show where the judges never tell you the rules and elimination is permanent. You recall figures like Marie Antoinette, often caricatured as frivolous. Mainstream history acknowledges she became a lightning rod for resentment in pre-revolutionary France. What's often overlooked is how court etiquette isolated her, foreign and young, under constant scrutiny. Historians still argue whether her actions genuinely worsened her position or whether she was doomed by being visible in a collapsing system that needed someone to blame. You feel the loneliness now. A queen is surrounded by people, yet starved of trust. Even her children can become political leverage. Affection is rationed, advice is filtered. Every interaction feels like a test you didn't study for. Over time, the performance becomes second nature. The smile stops slipping because it's glued on. Another light joke, because the tension is thick. If Botox had existed, the palace would have mandated it. You notice how quickly narratives form. A queen's silence becomes aloof. Her piety becomes fanatic. Her influence becomes manipulation. These stories circulate faster than facts, and by the time they reach the public, they're indistinguishable from truth. This is where palace intrigue does its most efficient work, by outsourcing judgment. There's an open scholarly debate that hangs heavy here. Historians still argue whether queens were active political agents constrained by misogyny, or passive figures destroyed by systems beyond their control. The evidence supports both interpretations depending on the woman and the moment. What remains consistent is the damage inflicted by constant evaluation. You walk past a chapel and sense the weight of expectation pressing inward. Even faith becomes performative. A queen must pray visibly, correctly, often. Private doubt is not allowed, neither is private grief. When miscarriages happen, as they often did, the loss is mourned publicly, politically, and never fully. You realize how palace intrigues destroy lives without ever appearing violent. They suffocate, they compress. They turn identity into a series of acceptable poses. By the time a queen is accused of something concrete, infidelity, influence, madness, her reputation has already been hollowed out. You glance back, down the corridor, the smiles remain, perfect, unbreakable, and you understand now that they aren't meant to reassure you. They're meant to watch you leave the room. You move on, carrying the echo of silk brushing stone, knowing that for many queens the palace was never a home. It was a stage where the performance never ended and where forgetting a single line could cost everything. You notice the boys before you notice the silence. Young princes move through the palace with tutors at their heels and expectations already stitched into their spines. They are dressed like miniature men, praised for composure, corrected for softness, and reminded constantly of who they are supposed to become. This is where the golden cage tightens, where privilege begins to feel suspiciously like confinement. You walk beside one of them, his shoes clicking too crisply on the stone floor. He's learned to walk this way, learned not to run, learned not to ask questions that drift beyond approved boundaries. He knows which rooms are his and which are forbidden. He knows which adults smile warmly and which ones smile carefully. What he doesn't know yet is how little of this is meant for his benefit. One mainstream historical fact shapes everything here. Royal heirs were raised communally, rarely by their parents, under strict educational and moral regimes designed to mold ideal rulers. Historians still argue whether this distance produced stronger kings or emotionally stunted ones, but the emotional cost is difficult to ignore. Affection was rationed, obedience was rewarded, vulnerability was corrected out of them early. You can feel it in the way he listens, not just to words, but to tone, pauses, glances. A prince learns court politics before he learns algebra. He understands hierarchy before empathy. He's praised for strength when he suppresses tears and for wisdom when he repeats what he's been told. Light joke number 1, softly delivered. Childhood, but make it corporate. The cage glitters. Tutors speak of destiny. Courtiers bow. Servants anticipate needs before they're voiced. But nothing here is spontaneous. Every interaction reinforces the same message. You are important, and therefore you are not free. Even play is structured. Even friendships are curated. Other children are chosen carefully, often for political reasons, then removed just as carefully when alliances shift. There's a quirky tidbit historians love to mention in passing. Some royal heirs kept secret diaries written in cipher or invented alphabets. It was one of the few ways to think freely without immediate correction. Historians still debate how private these diaries truly were, but the impulse itself is revealing. When a child needs encryption to express a feeling, the environment has already failed him. You notice how mistakes are handled. A misstep from a common child might be forgiven. From a prince, it's documented, discussed, sometimes leaked. Failures become cautionary tales told within earshot. A future king must be careful, they say, meaning obedient. The fear settles in early. Not fear of punishment, fear of disappointing an invisible standard that keeps shifting. You pass a training room where a young heir practices riding or fencing, watched by men who will one day advise him on war. He's applauded for aggression, for decisiveness. No one asks how he feels about hurting someone. That question doesn't fit the curriculum. Historians still argue whether this conditioning made rulers more effective or more dangerous, but the pattern repeats across centuries with eerie consistency. Another light joke, because otherwise this gets heavy fast. Imagine being told your entire personality is a leadership style. You begin to see how palace intrigue seeps into these young lives long before they understand it. Tutors disagree subtly in front of them. Courtiers praise one lesson over another. A favorite mentor is suddenly reassigned. The prince learns that relationships are temporary and loyalty is conditional. Trust becomes a risk assessment. You think of figures like Edward VI of England, crowned as a child and surrounded by powerful men eager to rule in his name. Mainstream history records his reign as brief and heavily influenced by advisors. What's quieter is the way his education and isolation made him dependent on those very figures. Historians still argue whether he would have ruled differently had he lived longer, but it's hard not to see how his upbringing shaped his vulnerability. You watch the prince pause at a window, staring out at ordinary people moving freely beyond palace walls. He doesn't envy them exactly, he's been taught not to, but something in him leans toward the simplicity of unobserved life. He straightens when someone approaches. The moment passes, the cage holds. As he grows older, the expectations sharpen. He's encouraged to form opinions, but only the right ones, to show strength, but not unpredictability. Advisors test him gently, then less gently. Each response is logged mentally. Who will he listen to? Who can influence him? Palace intrigue loves a malleable heir. It plans years ahead. There's an open scholarly debate that hums beneath all this. Historians still argue whether royal education systems were designed to protect heirs from chaos or to make them controllable. The answer may be both. Stability and manipulation often wear the same uniform. And for the prince, there's no opting out. You notice the loneliness deepen as childhood fades. Friends from earlier years drift away, replaced by advisors and potential rivals. Romantic attachments are discouraged or engineered. Emotional reliance is redirected toward duty. By the time he's old enough to question this, the habits are ingrained. The cage feels normal. Light joke number 3 gently. It's like growing up in a museum where you're both the exhibit and the security risk. You leave the training room behind and continue down the corridor. aware that many royal lives were quietly damaged here long before any public failure. By the time a prince makes a disastrous decision as king, the groundwork was laid decades earlier. Intrigue didn't wait for the crown. It helped shape it. As you move on, you carry the image of that young figure framed by a window, learning too early how narrow his world really is. The palace doesn't just destroy lives through scandal or exile. Sometimes it does it by design, raising rulers who never had the chance to become whole. And ahead of you, other lives are unraveling too, through words written in ink, meant for no one else, but destined to be read by everyone. You feel the change before you see it. The palace air grows heavier, as if words themselves have weight now. Ink has entered the story, and with it, permanence. Letters are being written in small rooms late at night, hands steady, but hearts not so much. This is where private thoughts begin their slow, dangerous journey toward public ruin. You pause beside a writing desk abandoned in haste. Wax curls lie discarded like shed skin. The letter is gone, of course, but you can almost hear its tone. Careful, affectionate, maybe frustrated. Letters were never meant to be weapons, yet in palaces they become some of the most efficient ones. Spoken words fade, written words wait. One mainstream historical fact underpins this quiet menace. Royal courts relied heavily on correspondence to govern, negotiate, and maintain alliances. Letters were copied, archived, intercepted, and reread obsessively. Historians still argue whether surveillance of correspondence was systematic or opportunistic, but the outcome was the same. Privacy was fragile at best. You imagine someone writing by candlelight, choosing each phrase like stepping stones across a river. Say too much and you drown, say too little and you invite suspicion. Even affectionate language is risky. Warmth can be reframed as intimacy. Concern can be rebranded as criticism. Context is everything, and context is the first thing removed. There's a quirky, almost darkly funny tidbit here. Some courtiers develop deliberately bland writing styles, mastering a kind of emotional beige. The goal was to be unreadable, unimpressive, forgettable. Historians still debate whether this strategy actually protected anyone, but it reveals how dangerous sincerity had become. When honesty feels reckless, intrigue is already winning. You sense how letters circulate, not directly, never cleanly. A servant glimpses a phrase, a clerk copies a page. A confidant repeats a line from memory, just slightly wrong. By the time the letter reaches its unintended audience, it's no longer a message, it's evidence. Light joke number 1, congratulations, your vent text just became a court exhibit. You think of figures like Mary, Queen of Scots. Mainstream history acknowledges that letters, real, forged or altered, played a crucial role in sealing her fate. The infamous correspondence implicating her in conspiracy remains debated. Historians still argue whether the letters were authentic, manipulated, or strategically interpreted. But what matters here is simpler. Once the letters existed, control over their meaning was lost. You feel the dread that must have followed. Knowing something you wrote in confidence is now being read aloud by enemies, that your own words are being used to define you. In the palace, authorship doesn't equal authority. Interpretation belongs to whoever holds power at the moment. You pass a small chamber where someone is being questioned gently. No accusations yet, just clarifications. Did you mean this? Can you explain that phrase? The questions sound reasonable. That's what makes them lethal. Each answer creates more text, more material, to be reassembled later. Silence looks guilty. Speaking looks worse. Another light joke slips in because you need relief. Never reply all, especially in the 16th century. You notice how letters don't just destroy reputations, they fracture relationships. Friends turn cautious, Lovers grow distant. Everyone becomes aware that words leave trails. Conversations grow stilted. Trust evaporates. Historians still argue whether the rise of written bureaucracy strengthened states or weakened human bonds. But inside palaces, the emotional damage is undeniable. You imagine a queen rereading a letter she once cherished, now terrified by it. A phrase that once felt tender now sounds incriminating. Tone shifts under pressure.
Memory becomes unreliable. Did she really mean that? Did she really write it that way? Doubt creeps in, not just about the letter, but about herself. There's another fringe detail scholars like to argue over. Some incriminating letters were allegedly assembled from fragments, stitched together to imply coherence that never existed. Whether true or exaggerated, the fear of it was real. The palace didn't need perfect evidence, it needed plausible narrative, and letters provided structure. You move through the corridor as messengers hurry past, boots soft but urgent. Each carries folded paper that could elevate or erase someone. The palace doesn't announce when a letter becomes dangerous. You find out when doors stop opening. By the time scandal breaks, it feels sudden to the public. Inside, it's been fermenting for months. The letter was only the spark. The kindling was already stacked. Palace Intrigue loves documentation because it looks objective. Ink doesn't shout, it condemns quietly. You leave the writing rooms behind, but the feeling lingers, that nothing written here ever truly disappears. Somewhere a sentence meant for one pair of eyes is being reread by many. And somewhere else, someone is learning too late that words, once freed, never come back. Ahead, the palace grows more intimate, more dangerous still. Bedrooms await, places where power pretends to rest but never actually sleeps. You slow your steps as the palace grows quieter, not emptier, just more careful. The noise fades the closer you get to the private apartments, where doors are thicker and carpets swallow sound. This is the most misleading part of the palace. Bedrooms suggest rest, intimacy, maybe even safety. In reality, this is where power sheds its public costume and becomes personal, and therefore far more dangerous. You feel it immediately. The air is warmer here, perfumed, heavy with the illusion of privacy. Conversations drop into whispers, not because fewer people are listening, but because everyone assumes someone is. Bedrooms in royal palaces were never just for sleeping. They were offices, confessionals, negotiation chambers, and traps, all wrapped in silk. One mainstream historical fact anchors this unease. In many early modern courts, access to the monarch's bedchamber was a formal position of power. Roles like the groom of the stool in England or similar offices across Europe granted intimate physical proximity to the ruler. Historians still argue whether these positions were purely practical or deliberately political, but their influence was undeniable. To be near someone at their most vulnerable was to hold leverage no council seat could match. You imagine sitting on the edge of a grand bed, listening as someone speaks more freely than they ever would in daylight. Fatigue loosens tongues. Desire blurs judgment. Fear seeks comfort. This is where secrets are traded not for money, but for reassurance. And reassurance in palaces is a scarce commodity. There's a quirky, unsettling tidbit here. Some monarchs deliberately held important meetings while dressing or undressing, believing it disarmed their listeners. It wasn't just theatre, it worked. People off balance reveal more.
Historians still debate how intentional this psychological tactic was, but the pattern appears too often to be accidental. You sense how intimacy becomes currency. A confidant today becomes a liability tomorrow. Lovers are elevated, then resented. Even marriages, supposedly sacred, are political instruments sharpened daily. Light joke number 1, carefully placed. Imagine pillow talk where every sentence might end up in a trial transcript. You think of figures like Henry VIII, whose private relationships shape the fates of queens and courtiers alike. Mainstream history records his marriages and executions. What's quieter is how access to his private chambers determined who rose and who vanished. Historians still argue whether his decisions were driven more by personal insecurity or political necessity, but inside the palace the distinction hardly mattered. Bedrooms are where accusations take root. A glance becomes evidence, a visit becomes implication. The absence of witnesses doesn't protect you, it condemns you. In public rooms, ambiguity can be dismissed. In private ones, ambiguity is fatal. Palace intrigue thrives on what cannot be proven cleanly. You pass a doorway where laughter once spilled out too freely. Now it's closed. Someone crossed an invisible line. Maybe they stayed too long. Maybe they were seen leaving at the wrong hour. Maybe someone wanted them gone and needed a story. In the palace, motive matters less than opportunity. Another light joke slips through the tension. The worst Airbnb reviews in history were written about royal bedrooms. You feel the imbalance of power sharpen here. A monarch's vulnerability does not equal a courtier's. One person's mistake becomes a footnote. Another's becomes a scandal. Historians still argue whether intimacy humanized rulers or isolated them further, but the damage flowed downhill regardless. You imagine a queen lying awake, aware that her husband's affections are not just personal wounds, but political threats. A favorite's presence at night echoes loudly by morning. Rumors travel faster when they originate from behind closed doors. And unlike letters, these rumors can't be disproven. They live on suggestion alone. There's an open scholarly debate hovering here. Historians still argue whether sexual intrigue was exaggerated by later moralists or genuinely central to court politics. The truth likely lies between. Desire didn't cause palace intrigue, but it made it efficient. It provided plausible explanations for removals already desired. You move away from the apartments, feeling the strange chill that follows intimacy abused by power. Bedrooms promise rest, but here they deliver exposure. The palace doesn't sleep, it watches even when the lights are low. As you step back into a broader corridor, you sense that what began as whispers and letters has now reached into flesh and breath territory. And the closer intrigue gets to the body, the harder it becomes to escape. Ahead, the voices change again. Advisors are waiting, calm, reasonable, and far too comfortable steering lives that aren't their own. You recognize them by how still they are. Advisors don't rush. They don't fidget. They sit comfortably inside other people's decisions, as if those decisions were always meant to arrive here. After the charged intimacy of the bedchambers, their rooms feel calm, almost therapeutic. That's the danger. Control rarely announces itself loudly. You enter a chamber lined with books, maps, and heavy chairs placed just far enough apart to suggest thoughtfulness. And this is where voices lower, brows furrow, and phrases like, "for your own good," are deployed with surgical precision. Advisors rarely seize power, they guide it gently, persistently, until the path ahead feels inevitable. One mainstream historical fact anchors this dynamic. Royal councils and privy advisors wielded enormous influence, especially during periods of weak, young, or distracted rulers. Historians still argue whether these figures were stabilizing forces or self-interested manipulators, but records show how often policy reflected their priorities more than the monarch's instincts. You sit in on a conversation that sounds reasonable, sensible even. An advisor lays out risks, another offers reassurance, a third frames a suggestion as protection of the crown, of tradition, of legacy. No one mentions personal gain, they never do. The most effective control doesn't feel like control, it feels like relief. Here's the thing you begin to notice. Advisors often speak in futures, not presents. This will prevent unrest. This could strengthen your position. this might avoid embarrassment. Each conditional nudges the ruler toward fear-based decision-making. Like joke number 1, it's like WebMD, but for kingdoms. Everything leads to catastrophe if untreated. You think of figures like Cardinal Richelieu, often portrayed as the architect of French absolutism. Mainstream history credits him with strengthening the state. What's debated is the cost. Historians still argue whether Richelieu's consolidation of power protected France or hollowed out its nobility through surveillance and suppression. From inside the palace, the effect was clear. Advisors didn't just counsel rulers, they reshaped the environment so alternative voices disappeared. You sense how this works practically. Advisors control information flow. They decide which letters reach the monarch's desk and which summaries replace full reports. They contextualize events before anyone else can. By the time the ruler reacts, the reaction has already been framed. Choice exists, but only within a curated range. There's a quirky tidbit historians sometimes whisper about. Some advisors deliberately cultivated reputations as dull or bureaucratic, believing invisibility increased longevity. Flashy ambition draws attention, quiet influence survives decades. Historians still debate how conscious this strategy was, but the pattern repeats often enough to feel intentional. You watch an advisor express concern about someone you've seen before, a courtier, a relative, maybe even a queen. The concern sounds empathetic. They seem overwhelmed. Perhaps too emotional lately? No accusation yet, just planting vocabulary. This is how libs begin to slide toward erasure. Once a label sticks, every action becomes proof. Another light joke, because the room is suffocating. If gaslighting had a coat of arms, it would hang right here. You feel how rulers grow dependent on this calm authority. Decision fatigue sets in. The palace is loud, advisors offer quiet. The palace is chaotic. Advisors offer order. Over time, trusting them feels not just sensible, but necessary. Historians still argue whether monarchs were complicit in their own manipulation or simply overwhelmed by structural pressure. Either way, the outcome rarely favored those without seats at the table. You notice what isn't said. Alternatives are dismissed before being voiced. Dissenting advisors are reassigned, retired, or discredited. Gradually, the room becomes an echo chamber. Consensus forms easily because disagreement no longer enters. From the outside, decisions look decisive. From the inside, they're pre-selected. You recall how young princes, raised in those golden cages, were especially vulnerable here. Their education taught obedience disguised as wisdom. Advisors step neatly into parental roles, reinforcing habits learned in childhood. Trust us. We know best. This is how it's always been done. Historians still argue whether these dynamics explain the frequency of disastrous reigns, but the psychological continuity is hard to ignore. There's a moment where you sense the shift, the point where advice becomes directive. It's subtle. A suggestion is repeated. A concern becomes urgent. A delay becomes dangerous. The ruler nods, perhaps relieved that someone else seems so certain. And just like that, agency thins. You watch a document being drafted. Language is softened, responsibility diffused. The final decision will bear the monarch's seal, but the fingerprints belong to many. When consequences arrive, blame will be shared just enough to protect the true architects. Palace intrigue loves committees. Another light joke, quietly cruel. Nothing ruins a life faster than a well-meaning subcommittee. You feel the moral distance widen. Advisors rarely see the human fallout. Exile becomes relocation. Imprisonment becomes containment. Execution becomes necessity. Words cushion reality. Historians still argue whether advisors believed their own euphemisms or used them knowingly. Either way, the effect was numbing. You imagine a ruler alone later, wondering how things escalated so quickly. how a trusted cousin became a threat, how a queen became a liability. The answer sits in these rooms, in conversations that felt reasonable at the time. Intrigue doesn't demand cruelty, it manufactures consent. As you leave, you glance back at the advisors, still calm, still composed, already discussing the next issue. They will survive regime changes, scandals, even wars. Others won't. That's the quiet genius of control. It outlives the people it destroys. You step back into the corridor, aware that belief itself is about to be weaponized next. Faith, doctrine, and righteousness are sharpening their edges, and the palace is more than ready to pretend it's all for the soul. You feel the temperature change again, not colder, just more rigid. Stone gives way to symbols, crosses, relics, prayer books, carefully positioned candles. The palace hasn't become holy, but it has learned how useful holiness can be. This is where belief stops being personal and starts being procedural, sharpened into something that cuts cleanly while claiming purity. You move through a chapel that smells faintly of incense and damp wool. Knees bend here automatically. Words are repeated without much thought. Faith, once intimate, is now public performance. And like all performances in the palace, it's judged closely. This is where factions form not around people, but around interpretations. One mainstream historical fact anchors the danger. Throughout medieval and early modern Europe, religious alignment was inseparable from political loyalty. Deviating from accepted doctrine, even subtly, could be framed as treason. Historians still argue whether religious conflicts at court were genuinely theological or primarily political, but inside the palace, belief functioned as a sorting mechanism. You were either with us or conveniently disposable. You notice how language shifts. No one says, "I disagree." They say, "This troubles my conscience." No one says, "I want you gone." They say, "This endangers souls." Once a moral argument enters the room, compromise becomes sin. And sin, unlike policy, demands punishment. There's a quirky, unsettling tidbit here. Some courtiers memorized multiple versions of prayers and creeds to match whichever faction was listening. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was survival. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was, but the anxiety behind it is undeniable. When belief is monitored, flexibility becomes armor. You watch a quiet accusation unfold. Someone mentions that another courtier no longer attends certain services. It's framed gently, concerned. A seed is planted. Absence becomes evidence. Silence becomes defiance. Soon, every action is filtered through suspicion. Light joke number 1, whispered irreverently. Nothing says danger like missing one meeting. You think of figures like Catherine of Aragon, whose piety was genuine yet politically inconvenient. Mainstream history records her resistance to annulment and her eventual displacement. What's often overlooked is how religious righteousness was used both for and against her, depending on who needed leverage. Historians still argue whether faith empowered her or trapped her, but it certainly marked her. You sense how belief hardens boundaries. Friends become doctrinal liabilities. Family members are quietly categorized. Even marriage beds are scrutinized for spiritual correctness. The palace doesn't care what you believe privately. It cares what your belief allows others to say about you. Another light joke slides in because otherwise this room suffocates. The only thing more dangerous than heresy is someone else defining it for you. You notice how easily violence is outsourced here. No one needs to order punishment directly. Once someone is labeled impure, the system responds automatically. Trials feel righteous. Exile feels merciful. Death feels regrettable, but necessary. Historians still argue whether rulers believed they were protecting faith or simply exploiting it. The result was the same: lives erased with clean hands. You pause near the altar and feel the strange comfort this weaponized belief provides to those in power. It absolves responsibility. God wills it is the oldest delegation of blame, and once invoked, it silences doubt. Doubt, after all, is dangerous. You leave the chapel aware that faith, once turned, doesn't need constant supervision. It polices itself. And as you step back into the palace proper, you realize the intrigue has grown legs. It no longer needs whispers or letters alone. It has righteousness now. Ahead, foreign faces arrive smiling, offering safety, alliance, escape. And the palace, ever hungry, prepares another lesson, this time about how far ruin can travel. You hear the accents before you see the faces. The palace grows suddenly lively, animated by new voices, unfamiliar manners, and the polite excitement that always accompanies outsiders. Foreign courts have arrived, bearing gifts, promises, and the illusion of distance from everything that's gone wrong so far. For a moment it feels like relief, a change of scenery, a reset. It isn't. You watch the greetings unfold, bows measured carefully, smiles calibrated just enough to suggest warmth without surrender. Alliances are being performed in real time. Every compliment carries a clause. Every toast hides a footnote. Foreign courts don't enter palaces innocently. They enter strategically. And if you're desperate, they can smell it. One mainstream historical fact grounds this danger. Royal marriages and alliances were central tools of diplomacy, often binding individuals to foreign courts they barely understood. Historians still argue whether these alliances genuinely promoted peace or simply exported conflict across borders. But for the people involved, the cost was immediate and personal. You imagine being offered escape disguised as opportunity. A marriage abroad, a posting in another court, a chance to start fresh where no one knows your past. It sounds merciful, it sounds safe. But the palace doesn't let go that easily. It sends you out carrying its narratives like luggage you can't put down. There's a quirky tidbit historians sometimes note with raised eyebrows. Foreign ambassadors often reported more on personal court gossip than on official policy. Scandal travelled faster than treaties. Historians still debate how much these reports shaped international decisions, but reputations rarely survive the journey intact. You feel how friendly faces can sharpen the knife. A foreign ally listens patiently as you explain yourself, nodding sympathetically. Later, those same words reappear in a different context, stripped of nuance. Translation becomes transformation. Light joke number 1. Nothing improves a rumor like a language barrier. You think of figures like Elizabeth of Bohemia, briefly crowned Queen of Bohemia and rapidly exiled. Mainstream history records her as the Winter Queen. What's quieter is how foreign alliances magnified her vulnerability. Historians still argue whether her downfall was inevitable given the politics of the 30 Years' War. But it's hard to ignore how quickly promises of support evaporated once consequences appeared. You notice how distance amplifies misunderstanding. Behaviors acceptable in one court read as arrogance or weakness in another. Customs clash, expectations misalign. And while you're busy adapting, others are narrating. By the time you realize the story has shifted, you're no longer the protagonist. Another light joke drifts in because the tension needs air. International relations, now featuring you as the cautionary tale. You see how foreign courts offer plausible deniability to those who want you gone. Sending you away looks generous. It sounds diplomatic. It removes the problem without blood. Exile abroad is exile with better branding. Historians still argue whether such arrangements were meant to protect individuals or sideline them quietly. The effect was often the same: distance without safety. You move through a reception hall filled with unfamiliar banners. Everyone is smiling, everyone is watching. You realize that being foreign anywhere is dangerous, but being foreign everywhere is fatal. Without a home court to defend you, your identity becomes negotiable. You sense the trap closing when communication slows. Letters arrive late. Support feels conditional. Allies hesitate. The palace you left behind is already revising your story, and the one you're standing in has no incentive to contradict it. You belong nowhere fully. And that is the most useful position of all for everyone but you. There's an open scholarly debate hovering here. Historians still argue whether international courts knowingly exploited vulnerable royals or simply reacted pragmatically to shifting power. Intent matters less than outcome. Isolation does the work regardless. You step away from the foreign delegation, understanding too late that distance didn't dilute intrigue, it concentrated it. With fewer witnesses, fewer allies, and fewer familiar rules, mistakes become permanent. And once your reputation fractures across borders, there's no court left to appeal to. As you turn back toward the palace interior, you feel the weight of something building. Intrigue has gone international, and when it returns home, it will do so loudly, wrapped in scandal, timed carefully, ready to explode. You sense it before anyone says a word. The palace feels tense in a new way, like a room right before a surprise party, except the surprise is public humiliation. This is the phase where intrigue stops whispering and starts rehearsing. Scandals don't erupt spontaneously here. They're engineered, calibrated, and released at the precise moment maximum damage can be achieved. You walk past groups that fall silent just a fraction too late. Papers are folded quickly. Glances dart, then settle somewhere neutral. This is where stories harden into accusations. Timing becomes everything. Too early, and no one cares. Too late, and the narrative has already moved on without you. One mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Many royal scandals emerged during periods of political instability, when public opinion mattered more than decorum. Pamphlets, sermons, and gossip networks spread narratives rapidly, often with tacit approval from those in power. Historians still argue whether these scandals reflected genuine moral outrage or were calculated distractions, but their orchestration is hard to ignore. You notice how carefully information is staged. A rumor appears in one corner of the court, repeated casually. A second source confirms it independently. A third adds emotional detail. By the time the story reaches the public, it feels organic, inevitable, like joke number one, dry and tired. Nothing goes viral by accident. You think of Marie Antoinette again, not because she fits every case, but because her image was so thoroughly dismantled. Mainstream history acknowledges the role of libelles, scandalous pamphlets, in destroying her reputation. What's debated is how much the crown underestimated their power. Historians still argue whether these publications merely reflected popular anger or actively manufactured it. Either way, once the story stuck, facts became irrelevant. You feel the cruelty of design here. Scandals are released when their targets are weakest, isolated, distracted, already doubted. Evidence doesn't need to be airtight, needs to be vivid. Emotion does the rest. In the palace, truth is optional. Resonance is mandatory. Another light joke slips in because otherwise this is unbearable. Scandal is just storytelling with worse editing. You watch someone try to respond, to clarify. Their words are careful, rational, reasonable. No one listens. Responses always sound defensive once the story is out. Silence looks guilty. Speaking looks desperate. Historians still argue whether any effective defense against palace scandal ever existed. The record suggests not many. You notice how institutions align quietly. Clergy condemn, advisors distance themselves, former allies go silent. Each absence reinforces the narrative. The scandal doesn't need universal belief, just enough to make resistance futile. And once official processes begin, The outcome feels preordained. You pass a notice being posted. The language is neutral, procedural. That's how you know it's serious. Neutral language is how the palace signals inevitability. Light joke number 3, barely there. Nothing says, "we've decided," like calm wording. You realize something chilling. Scandals don't just destroy their targets. They warn everyone else. This is theatre, a reminder of consequences. Historians still argue whether such spectacles were meant to enforce morality or obedience, but the message landed either way. Step out of line and we will rewrite you. As you move on, the noise grows. Whispers have turned into murmurs, murmurs into conversation. The palace has flipped the switch, and once it does, there's no turning it off. Ahead, another word waits to be used, one that sounds clinical, merciful, even progressive. Madness. And soon you'll see how easily it can erase a person without ever spilling blood. You hear the word before you understand the sentence. It floats gently through the palace, wrapped in concern, padded with sympathy. Unwell, unstable. Not quite themselves lately. This is where intrigue learns a softer language, one that sounds humane while quietly locking doors behind it. Madness doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives with a sigh. You feel the shift immediately. Accusations stop sounding angry and start sounding worried. People lower their voices, they tilt their heads, they speak about someone as if that person is already absent. This is the most efficient kind of erasure, when the subject is still alive, still breathing, but no longer considered fully present. One mainstream historical fact underpins this tactic. Throughout royal history, claims of mental instability were used to remove inconvenient figures from power without provoking open rebellion. Historians still argue whether diagnoses reflected genuine conditions or political necessity, but records show how frequently madness coincided with moments of threat, succession disputes, or scandal. You watch it unfold step by step. First comes observation. Someone notes erratic behavior, grief, anger, fear, all very human reactions. Then comes interpretation. Those emotions are reframed as patterns, then consensus forms quietly. By the time it's spoken aloud officially, it feels like confirmation, not accusation. There's a quirky, unsettling tidbit buried in court records. Some physicians attached to royal households were paid retainers that depended on pleasing the crown. Their assessments were rarely independent. Historians still debate how much medical opinion was shaped by pressure, but the incentives were obvious. A diagnosis could end a life socially without risking martyrdom. Light joke number 1, bitter and tired. Congratulations, your emotional response has been upgraded to a condition. You think of figures like Juana of Castile, remembered as Juana la Loca. Mainstream history acknowledges her prolonged confinement and questions surrounding her mental health. What remains debated is whether her instability was exaggerated or even manufactured to justify removing her from power. Historians still argue whether she was ill, exploited, or both. What's clear is that once labelled, she never escaped the label. You feel how madness is convenient because it reframes resistance as symptom. Protest becomes paranoia. Grief becomes hysteria. Anger becomes proof. The accused can speak endlessly and still say nothing that counts. The palace listens politely and records selectively. Another light joke slips through because the cruelty is clinical. Nothing ends an argument faster than diagnosing the speaker. You notice how isolation follows swiftly. For their own good, of course. Reduced visitors. Controlled correspondence, supervised movement, each restriction justified by care. By the time confinement becomes formal, it feels like the logical next step. Historians still argue whether these measures were protective or punitive, but the effect was identical: silence. You imagine the person alone now, wondering when they crossed the line, replaying conversations, searching for the moment everything shifted. The answer is rarely specific. Madness accusations don't need a trigger, they need timing. You pass a room where papers are being sorted, some documents are removed, others highlighted. The story is being curated. Once madness enters the narrative, history itself adjusts. Contradictions are ignored, achievements reframed as luck, failures amplified. The person shrinks on the page. There's an open, scholarly debate hovering here. Historians still argue whether mental illness in royal contexts can ever be separated from the political framework surrounding it. The sources are biased, the voices are missing, and the silence itself becomes evidence. You step back into the corridor, feeling the chill of a word that sounds gentle but kills agency completely. Madness doesn't need a trial, it doesn't need witnesses, it just needs agreement. And once agreement settles in, the palace moves on, cleanly, quietly, to the next stage. Some will be sent away politely, others will simply fade. Exile is waiting, dressed as mercy, and it knows your name. You don't hear the word exile spoken out loud at first. It arrives dressed as suggestion, a change of air, a quieter residence, somewhere peaceful, somewhere appropriate. The palace has learned that removal sounds kinder when it pretends to be care. This is where people vanish without disappearing, where life continues, just not where it matters. You walk through rooms being packed slowly, deliberately. Not hurried, not violent. That's important. Exile must look calm to feel justified. Trunks are filled with clothes selected by someone else. Papers are sorted for you. Travel plans are announced as if already agreed upon. Resistance would look ungrateful. One mainstream historical fact anchors this quiet brutality. Exile was a common political tool across monarchies used to neutralize rivals without execution. Historians still argue whether exile was intended as mercy or merely a less visible form of punishment, but many exiles died far from home, impoverished, forgotten, or psychologically broken. You feel the loss immediately, not of comfort, but of relevance. The palace continues without you. Meetings proceed. Decisions are made. Your absence becomes normal with terrifying speed. Light joke number 1, soft and sad. Nothing confirms your replacement like smooth scheduling. You think of figures like Napoleon Bonaparte, exiled first to Elba, then to St. Helena. Mainstream history frames these as pragmatic solutions to an unmanageable threat. What's quieter is how exile stripped him of narrative control. Historians still argue whether his final confinement was necessary or excessive, but the isolation was absolute. Exile doesn't need cruelty, distance does the work. There's a quirky tidbit that appears in letters from exiles. Many describe time becoming strangely elastic, days stretched, weeks blurred, without court rhythms, identity thinned. Historians still debate whether this disorientation was psychological trauma or simple adjustment, but the loneliness is consistent across accounts. You notice how correspondence dries up. Letters arrive late, if at all. News comes filtered, incomplete. You are no longer inside the conversation. You are its footnote. Rumors reach you distorted, already settled. You can't respond in time, even if anyone cared to listen. Another light joke, whispered into the quiet. Exile is just being muted by history. You imagine walking through a foreign estate or a remote castle or a damp island, listening to the wind instead of whispers. At first, the silence feels merciful, then it becomes accusatory. Without constant feedback, you start to doubt your own memories. Was it really that bad? Did you misstep? Historians still argue whether exile produced reflection or despair. The record suggests both, and neither changes the outcome. You sense how exile protects the palace more than the person. It removes complexity. It avoids martyrdom. It allows everyone else to move on untroubled. Meanwhile, the exiled becomes an abstraction. Danger contained, problem solved. You leave the packed rooms behind, watching doors close softly. No locks needed. The palace knows you won't return. And in the space you once occupied, someone else is already standing, careful not to mention you. As you move forward, you understand that exile isn't the end of palace intrigue. It's just the moment where the damage becomes irreversible. Some survive it, some don't. But all are altered. Ahead, the palace prepares its most formal gesture yet. A trial. Not for justice, but for closure. You feel the weight of it the moment you step inside. The room is arranged too neatly, too symmetrically, as if order itself is part of the verdict. Chairs face forward, papers are stacked, officials are present not to discover truth but to confirm it. This is where palace intrigue puts on its cleanest clothes and calls itself justice. You take your place, if you're allowed one at all. The faces watching you are familiar, but distant now. They've already decided how this ends. Trials in royal contexts were rarely about guilt or innocence. They were about legitimacy, about making an outcome look inevitable, reasonable, lawful. One mainstream historical fact anchors this reality. Many royal trials were conducted under extraordinary legal frameworks, often with limited defense rights and predetermined charges. Historians still argue whether these trials followed the legal standards of their time or flagrantly violated them, but contemporaries often recognized them as performances rather than inquiries. You listen as charges are read aloud, each one crafted to sound sober, measured. Language matters here. Emotion is excluded, context omitted. By the time you recognize your own life in the words, it's been flattened into a list of transgressions. Light joke number 1, hollow and tired. Nothing makes you feel innocent like hearing your life summarized by strangers. You think of Anne Boleyn again, standing trial before men who had everything to gain from her conviction. Mainstream history acknowledges the political motivations behind her downfall. What remains debated is how much the legal process mattered at all. Historians still argue whether the trial was a necessary formality or pure theatre. Either way, the verdict was never in doubt. You notice how evidence is presented selectively. Witnesses appear confident, rehearsed. Contradictions are smoothed over. Defense arguments are acknowledged politely, then dismissed. The structure itself enforces momentum. No one wants to slow this down. Closure is the goal. Another light joke drifts in, because irony is the only defense left. At least the chairs are comfortable. You feel how trials serve the audience more than the accused. They reassure the court that order still exists, that boundaries are enforced, that consequences follow deviation. Historians still argue whether public trials stabilized monarchies or exposed their fragility. The effect, however, was chillingly consistent. You sense the finality settling in before the verdict is spoken. Once the process begins, there is no exit that preserves dignity. Acquittal would imply error elsewhere, and the palace does not admit error. Conviction cleans the narrative. The sentence, when it comes, sounds almost gentle. Exile confirmed, titles removed, property reassigned. In harsher cases, execution ordered with solemn regret, responsibility diffused across the room. No single voice owns the outcome. You stand or are led out of the chamber, aware that this ritual has accomplished exactly what it was meant to. The story is complete now. The palace can breathe again. As you step back into the corridor, you understand that the trial wasn't the end of your life's destruction. That happened long before. This was just the punctuation. And beyond these doors, others are watching carefully, learning what survival requires. Some will adapt, some will endure, and some, quietly, permanently, will carry the damage forward. You don't leave the palace cleanly, no one ever does. Even the ones who survive, who keep their titles, their incomes, their carefully moderated access, carry something away with them. It's not visible. It doesn't announce itself. But it changes how they move through rooms, how they speak, how long they pause before answering even harmless questions. These are the survivors, and survival has marked them. You notice them immediately. They're quieter than they used to be. Not withdrawn, controlled. Their smiles arrive late and leave early. They stand where exits are visible. They never sit with their back fully turned to the room. The palace hasn't destroyed them outright. It has taught them. One mainstream historical fact grounds this transformation. Many royals and high-ranking courtiers who lived through scandals, purges, or trials went on to play cautious, often diminished roles in later political life. Historians still argue whether this restraint reflected wisdom gained through suffering or trauma-induced self-censorship, but their behavior changed in unmistakable ways. You walk beside one such survivor now, once outspoken, now precise. Once impulsive, now meticulously boring. They choose safety over brilliance every time. Light joke number 1, gently sad. Nothing says longevity like becoming forgettable. There's a quirky tidbit buried in personal accounts. Some survivors developed elaborate routines, same walks, same meals, same schedules, as a way to regain control. Predictability became comfort. Historians still debate whether these habits were coping mechanisms or subtle forms of anxiety, but the need for structure runs like a quiet thread through their later lives. You hear how they speak about the past, carefully. Names are avoided, events are summarized vaguely. That period, those difficulties, the palace has trained them to narrate without detail. Too much clarity invites questions. And questions, as everyone here knows, are dangerous. You think of figures like Elizabeth the Faultless, who survived imprisonment, suspicion, and constant threat before ascending the throne. Mainstream history celebrates her resilience. What's quieter is how her reign was shaped by caution, her reluctance to marry, her reliance on intelligence networks, her emotional reserve. Historians still argue whether these traits were strategic genius or scars. Perhaps they were both. Another light joke slips in because otherwise this aches too much. Trust issues, but make them constitutional. You notice how survivors become teachers without meaning to. Younger courtiers watch them closely, learning what not to do. Silence becomes wisdom. Distance becomes strength. The palace adapts, evolving its etiquette around collective memory. Intrigue doesn't just destroy individuals, it reshapes culture. There's an open scholarly debate humming beneath this observation. Historians still argue whether royal courts grew more stable or more paranoid over time. Did survivors create safer systems or simply normalize fear? The answer depends on where you stand. For those inside, caution feels like progress. For those crushed by it, it feels like inheritance of harm. You feel the emotional residue lingering in rooms long after the drama's ended. Survivors walk through spaces where others fell, careful not to linger. They don't forget, they just compartmentalize. The palace allows this. It prefers people who can carry weight quietly. As you move on, you realize survival isn't a victory here. It's a condition, one that demands constant maintenance. And while these figures live on, the damage they carry doesn't disappear. It travels forward into decisions, into families, into the future itself. Ahead, the palace feels different again. Less crowded, more reflective. The echoes are louder now. And soon you'll see how all these ruined lives continue to shape royal behavior long after the players themselves are gone. You slow your pace without realizing it. The palace feels quieter now, not because fewer people are here, but because the past has grown heavier than the present. Every corridor carries echoes of footsteps that stopped abruptly, of voices that learned when not to speak. These echoes don't fade. They settle into tradition, into habit, into instinct. You begin to see how destroyed lives never truly leave royal spaces. They become cautionary shapes, invisible but instructive. Rules exist because someone once broke them and vanished. Etiquette hardens because deviation once proved fatal. The palace remembers even when it pretends not to. One mainstream historical fact frames this inheritance. Modern monarchies are deeply shaped by historical trauma, often codifying informal rules born from earlier crises. Historians still argue whether this continuity reflects institutional wisdom or unresolved fear, but the influence is undeniable. Behavior today is guided by ghosts. You notice it in modern restraint, public neutrality, emotional distance, carefully managed appearances. These aren't just PR strategies. They are survival reflexes passed down like heirlooms. Light joke number 1, soft and knowing. Tradition is just fear with good tailoring. You think of how contemporary royals avoid controversy with almost ritual precision. Marriages are vetted, statements rehearsed, silence preferred. Historians still argue whether this caution preserves relevance or accelerates irrelevance, but the motivation is clear. The palace has learned what attention can do. There's a quirky but telling detail historians sometimes mention. Royal households maintain internal archives of past scandals, not for study, but for avoidance. Not what happened, but what never to repeat. Memory becomes policy. You feel the emotional temperature cool further. The palace isn't cruel now, it's careful. And that carefulness is built on centuries of loss. Lives undone by whispers, favor, faith, ink, diagnoses, distance. Each one taught the institution how to protect itself better next time. Another light joke drifts in, barely audible. History doesn't repeat itself here. It files reports. You stand still for a moment, aware that intrigue hasn't vanished. It's simply refined. Softer edges, cleaner exits, less blood, more silence. The damage continues, just quieter. Historians still argue whether royal institutions can ever fully escape the weight of their past, or whether survival itself requires carrying it forward. From where you stand, it feels less like learning and more like remembering too well. The palace lights dim as you turn away, leaving the echoes to echo. And for the first time tonight, the quiet doesn't feel threatening. It feels tired. The palace grows distant now, its corridors stretching into something softer, less defined. The whispers lose their urgency, turning into a low, steady hush like wind moving through heavy curtains. The faces blur, the scandals dissolve, and the weight you've been carrying eases from your shoulders. You don't need to solve anything tonight. You don't need to remember every name, every betrayal, just the feeling that power leaves marks and history breathes slowly. Your thoughts drift, unanchored now, floating away from stone walls and candlelight into something darker, calmer, quieter.